Hello everyone, today's poem is Chen Wan, a Chen Wind from the Book of Songs. This is the first poem in Chen Wind, so before we start the poem, I will talk a little about the Chen Wind and the Chen State. So the Chen State is not a Zhou state, which means the lord of Chen is not from the Zhou family. He's with another family name, and his ancestor could be traced to the Shun. So Yao Shun is the most two famous and the two best kings in the Chinese history. And this is the tradition in the Chinese history that when a new dynasty came to the throne, they will entitle the previous three dynasty as one of the state, so which in Chinese 三克. And there's two saying how the three previous dynasty was defined, but that's not a big deal for the Chen State. Chen State is the state lord is the descendant of Shun, and so Shun was the king, and he ruled the whole country from this place in Shanxi province today. When the second king, Wang, the king of Wu, came to the throne in the Zhou dynasty, he allocated a piece of land here in this place was named as Chen, and thus the state name is Chen Guo. And this place is a very, very important and key state in the history because the very ancient, the first Chinese, of course, is a sort of the fairy tale story. The first Chinese, Fuxi, he was buried here, and this place somewhere in this state, Chen State, around this place is his capital place. And finally, he was buried at Wanqiu, a hill named as Wan. So Wan is a very sensitive and subtle words, and normally it was expressed or interpreted as something with a very nice but a little bit curved gesture. But I would rather think one is the action to hold something, and you curved your wrist, so that is one. And this is very frequently used in a funeral when the huge coffin of the passed away lord was pulled over from the capital, from the ancestors' temple in the capital to the suburb where the cemetery was located. So that takes thousands of people to pull that big cart of coffin, and this is also a very, very touching and a very emotional and a very labor intensive event for the whole state, for everybody in the state. And thus this term Wan became some of the term with many meanings and subtle meanings. So Wanqiu, I do believe, is to memorize to the first Chinese king, Fuxi, and when the people buried his coffin in this place, and they named his tomb, a small hill, as Wanqiu, because people have a lot of the work to fulfill this task, to pull the coffin over and bury the coffin over. And also it's a very, very sad moment. So you can see a lot of the words associated with the funeral. This term, Wan Lian, the poster with the sentence and the words to memorize, to pay condolence to the passed away people. So that's what's so called as Wan Lian. Normally it was put on the big flowers, just like in the picture. In the early stage of the Zhou dynasty, Chen State is a very strategic state because of the its locations. It's just like the crossroad in the East China, and the king of Wu married his eldest daughter to the state lord of Chen, which shows he pays the most respect, and he's valued the Chen State, the state lord of the Chen, the most, because he's married his eldest daughter to this state. And that's the way the value chain the Zhou people built. The elder, the better, the more respectful. And that still today in China, we still have this tradition. Not so much, but still a lot. Let's say we pay a lot of the respect to the elder people. That's one of it. Okay, let's get to this simple poem. So the first poem in the state winds normally is about the ancestors, and this one does either. 子之汤兮，晚秋之上兮. So my lord, he went to the place of Tang, and that place was located above the hill of Wan. So here is two key words. Wanqiu, we know it's the hill, small hill. It's very likely is the tomb or the city of the very, very first Chinese, Fuxi. And Fuxi in the recorded history is a sort of the fairy tale stories, a fairy tale figure, half divine, half human. And this was a little bit approved. The history is in this place. Look at the picture. It's a small hill, and it's some construction and some relics on this small hill. It's very likely a man-made hill. It's not a nature hill of the nature. And there are rats of the chariot found, which dated back 4,200 years ago in this place. Of course, the first Chinese Fuxi should be much earlier. He belongs to a much earlier period compared sometime 4,200 years ago. But still, this place is a very, very ancient place, a civilized place, could be dated back very, very to the very, very ancient time. So, and here, Tang, we don't know exactly what it means, but the first king of the Shang dynasty his name is Tang, and so here, with a very wild imagination, if I interpret the first sentence, I would say this lord goes to the temple of the Tang, the king of Tang, the first emperor of the Shang dynasty, and that temple was located above this hill of Wan. So here is the problem or the question, because the state of Chen is not a state of the Shang dynasty or the descendants of the Shang dynasty, and the state lord is the descendant of Shun, not Shang dynasty, and so the lord. So there could be one problem, that the lord in this poem is not the state lord, and his family belongs to the is the descendant of the Shang dynasty, the royal family of the Shang dynasty. So for him, he went to the temple of the Tang, the first king of the Shang dynasty. That's quite reasonable. He went there to pray to his ancestors, right? And that temple was located above the hill of Wan. So that's the case. And this is not strange, because within a state in the Zhou dynasty, there are many different families, and their origins could be from different ancestors. And so the first poem in the Chen Wind has a big problem. Why? Because it was not written by the tribe, by the family of the state lord. So for Chinese, that's not correct. The first something in the center should always be the key person. And in the state wind of Chen, the first poem, which is the most important poem, was written by someone else. That's not correct. So that was, I have this feeling, because there's a very famous commentary in the State and Warrior, the Warrior States time. The Spring and Autumn's time. He is a prince of the Wu kingdom, and he has the comments for each state winds, and for the Chen Wind, he has a comment that the song in the Chen Wind, it shows there's no lord. So that may be the case, and in the following poems, songs in the Chen Wind, we can also have this sort of the feelings. The state lord is not written, or he was not writing the poem in the Chen Wind. All the poems in the Chen Wind was written something irrelevant to the state lord. So that's a big problem, and that's why this state was destroyed, vanished very early, even it was a very powerful and strategic state in the early Zhou dynasty. And because the king doesn't behave himself, and gradually from through the hundreds years of time, the state became weaker and weaker, and it messed up, and then in a chaos time, in the warrior state time, this state vanished in a very early time. So that's also a lesson for Chinese, that you should behave yourself, and you should fulfill your duty diligently. Otherwise, in the long run, you will have your problem, small or big. Okay, let's continue. The second sentence. 荀有清兮而无妄兮. The Lord is trustworthy, and he was full of emotion and feelings. So what kind of feelings? He's thinking about his ancestors, right? His ancestor of the first king in the Shang dynasty, the king of Tang, right? And the next sentence, 而无望兮, there is no hope at all. So that's the normal translation. But with my interpretation, 而无望兮 has a very real and delicate meaning. The Chinese, when they pray to their ancestors, we have to go to the very site of the ancestors, which means where he was buried. And near the cemetery, there is ancestors' temples. So either you go to the ancestors' temples or you go to the cemetery. But for the Lord in this poem, he was a descendant of the Shang dynasty, the royal family of the Shang dynasty. But it's too far to the cemetery of the Shang king, the king of Tang. So it's rough, maybe several hundreds miles, thousands miles between. He cannot look to the cemetery, to the real ancestors' temples. Maybe in this time it was all destroyed, but at least the cemetery was still there, right? So 无望 means the poet was unable to look at his ancestors' cemetery, his tomb. And this also complies to the ancient Chinese, that the ancient Chinese believe the dead lived together with the people live. But in reality, you cannot see each other, but at least you know very well where he was buried, and that means where he was lived in another world, a world you cannot see. So when the ancient Chinese want to pray, to make a sacrifice to their ancestors, they always go to the cemetery and think about their ancestors and look to the tombs with the hope that they can see something. And in this poem, the poet was far, far away from his ancestors' cemetery, so there is no way to see the tomb, to see the cemetery. And finally, today, in the modern Chinese, 无望 means there is no hope. And this is sort of the derived meaning, and very likely from this poem. Okay, with the first paragraph, the second and third paragraph is quite simple and easy. It's a description of the sacrifice or pray or whatsoever, or entertainment. So when when the pray to the ancestors or sacrifice to the ancestors is composed of a lot of things: the singing, dancing, offer the sacrifice, and drinking together. So all the things, the happy things, the good things you have done with your ancestors in the real life, and when you pray to your ancestors, you do it again in the ancestor temple or at the cemetery. So let's go see how they pray to offer their sacrifice to entertain their ancestors in the third paragraph. 砍其击鼓，晚秋之下. So we strike our drums under the Hill of Wan. So that means they are approaching to the Hill of Wan, and at the moment they are not climb up the hill yet, so they're still at the foot of the hill. 无冬无夏，直其陆羽. No matter it's a winter time or no matter it's a summer time, we hold the feather of the egret bird. So the egret bird is a pure white bird, and the feather is a pure white feather. And here it doesn't tell too much, but from other historical books we know the ancient Chinese in the Zhou dynasty, they hold the feather to dance, and so here they hold a pure white feather. So the pure white normally in the Book of Science time means something with the funerals, with their ancestors. So in the second paragraph, they strike drums, and kan could be a ritual, which means they dig a hole on the ground and pour the wines into it, because when the people died, and which means the ancestors, they are buried in the ground, and to pour the wines into the earth, which means to let their ancestors under the ground to enjoy the wines. So all the rituals in this case is to entertain, to enjoy, to offer food to their ancestors, just like they are still alive. So the normal words is 视死如是生. The ancient Chinese take the dead people to serve the dead people as they are serving the people who are still alive. So it's the same ritual for the people alive and for the people who has died. Okay, let's see the third paragraph. Basically, it's identical to the second paragraph. 砍其击否，晚秋之道. So we're striking the musical instrument of fo. So just look at the picture. So it's a very decent and formal musical instrument. And in the Olympic game 2008 in Beijing, there is a big dancing with this musical instrument, with roughly 1,000 people play this musical instrument. It's like a big table, a square, but maybe in the ancient time it's different, but it's a decent and a formal musical instrument. And can, or still, to pour the wine into the hole in the ground, which means another way to entertain their ancestors. And now they are on the way on top of the Hill of Wan, which means they have almost reached, or they may be already reached to their destination, their ancestor temple of the king of Tang. And 无冬无夏, so no matter it's a winter's day and in the summer's day, they do this ritual to express their thinking, their respect to their ancestors. 执其鹿道, though we are hold the feather made of the egret bird. 鹿道 is very clearly it's a instrument for dancing. It's could be a decoration or a sort of the things used for dancing, and it's made of the feather of the egret bird. Still, it's a wide component, right? And they are dancing. They are do their best to entertain their ancestors. And so this poem is quite simple, and the key point is how we interpret the first pair of sentences. 子之汤兮，晚秋之上兮. And I do believe the Tang is a key word, and it was referring to the first king of the Shang dynasty. And the poet who was writing this poem was not from the family of the state lord. He of course he was not the state lord, neither. He was from another family, which was the descendant of the royal family of the Shang dynasty, and thus they went to the Hill of Wan to make their offering, to entertain their ancestors, the king of Tang. Okay, that's for today. Simple, but has a lot of the mysterious arguments still. And you could also try to dig out your answer for this poem. Bye bye.